Can you all hear me? Well, I was just sitting down there with the girls a minute ago and we were wondering who we was talking about. But you're all very, very welcome indeed, especially in this holy year, this year of Jubilee, in which the Holy Father himself has called for a new springtime of evangelization in the church. And in a very special way, as Don said, the Holy Spirit moved you to be here so that you can share in those qualities that are distinctly divine mercy. And for each one of you to be slightly different, but to sort of draw you in today and to ask you to kind of think a little bit. I want to bring your attention to the theme of the conference, which is, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Now, I suppose today it's not very popular maybe to hold up icons or people that you can look up to. Certainly we all know in the past that people we have looked up to have tended to let us down. But it is with great delight that I am able to commend you today. And very shortly what Father Collar said, that the Holy Father is going to beatify Sister Faustina. And it's with great pleasure that I'm able to hold up to her as someone who can be an icon, as someone who can be looked up to, and as someone who has had the whole spiritual treasury that she's going to share with the Church. And for those of you that don't know an awful lot about Sister Faustina, what I'd like to say to you is that she was born on the 25th of August 1905 in the province of Lodz. She saw in her lifetime the First World War. She was of farming stock and she had great prudence. She didn't have very, very much education at all. And around the time that she was about 18 or so, she was at a dance one evening and she had the mystical grace of seeing Jesus crucified. And he said to her, "My daughter, how long will I suffer you? How long will I put up with you? How long do you keep putting me off?" And after that, according to her own writings, we're told that she sought to become a Mercy Sister, or a Magdalene Sister as they're called in Poland. She worked for about a year before she could find acceptance, because in those days, I'm sure many of the older sisters here would remember the idea of a diary. You had to have a diary to actually enter the order. So she worked, and the Reverend Mother at the time said her as naught. She said, I don't find an awful lot in this girl. Now, soon after she entered the order, she began to have experiences of Jesus teaching her many things about the spiritual life and giving her a deeper understanding of his divine mercy and what he wanted her to do for the world. In actual fact, he himself formed her soul. Faustina, for most of her life, had a dreaded disease, tuberculosis of the bones, and she could actually smell herself rotting. And she was very, very quiet, very, very retiring. And yet it was to her that Jesus actually gave these revelations of divine mercy. She died at the age of 33 in an obscure convent in Poland. She never once in her lifetime actually proclaimed the divine mercy. That was all done through her spiritual director, Michael Sopoćko. Now, I suppose you could really and truly sum up Sister Faustina's spirituality in two essential foundation stones. She listened and she was able to trust what she heard. Now, they say that the best form of flattery is imitation. Now, Faustina did more than just flatter the Lord by her imitation. She took very seriously the command to listen. And during her lifetime, there were many other voices that she had to listen to. There were voices that would say to her that she was mad, an hysteric, a lunatic. There were voices that said, because she didn't realize very little known in those days about TB, that she shirked her responsibilities, that she didn't pull her fair share in the order, that she was a delusionary. And she practiced the Ignatian way of humility. She never spoke out. And she began to practice silence. And in the silence, she began to have these visions and images in which our Lord communed with her. Now, I suppose it's true to say that Jesus loves every one of us in a very special way indeed. for her own qualities. The qualities that he most loved Faustina for was her ability, as I said, to be able to listen and trust in what she heard. Because in that, he was able to see the gift that the Father is, and he was able to give praise back to God in that, you see. And this is why when you hear the command, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him," when you hear that, what in actual fact is happening is God is saying, "This is Jesus, my Son. I've put all of these gifts and talents into him, and I've put them into you too, because you're images and reflections of this." And that's why he loved Faustina, and he loves you no less. Now, if we could just maybe take a little time just to think about listening. Have you ever asked yourself, what is it that prevents me from listening? I told you that Faustina had other voices. But if you take this spirituality and you apply it to yourself, the first thing you have to begin to ask yourself is, what is it that prevents me hearing and listening? Well, for each one of us, the answer to that question may be different. But if we want to advance in the spiritual life, if we want to understand God's mercy, the strange paradox of this is that we have to shut up in order to be opened up. I know that sounds peculiar to say that, but the tongues have to stop. The ears have to be opened. And Faustina caught that on very quickly indeed. And as she began to listen, she began to be transformed by what she heard. And what did she hear? She heard Jesus speak to her of his divine mercy, of his love for mankind, of his absolute godliness about the human race. She heard him lament the fact that so few souls actually know anything about his mercy. She heard him lament the fact that even those who do know and should be preaching it don't. He asked her for a special day to be set aside on which his mercy would be worshipped in three ways: by word and deed, by prayer, by contemplation of the image, by priests who would preach sermons, or the chaplet of divine mercy. And all of this was to be given as a last resort to a suffering, aching mankind. Many times you hear him say to her, "My daughter, if only an aching mankind knew how much I loved it, how much I want for it, how much I want to give." But he said, "You at least console me by taking the graces that they won't take." And she'd never have been able to take any of that if she hadn't learned how to be still. And in the stillness, she began to discover her own ego. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but people who are, more brains than I have, tell me that this ego is that part in you that always wants to be pushing itself forward. Right? This is the part that Jesus and the temptations rejected. They wouldn't use that godly power they had. In us, it's the temptation to assert ourselves over the rights of other people. In the last week, you'll have seen that in Northern Ireland. You've heard all the rhetoric, but they haven't listened to one another. Because when you start to listen to people, they become transformed. Now, one of the things that becomes important when we begin to become a listener is to become aware of ourselves. And Faustina became aware of herself. And she became aware of all of these different problems that she had. Difficulties with listening, maybe wanting to speak out, maybe wanting to defend her own corner, maybe wanting to. And I'm not saying that at certain times that isn't good, but I'm also turning around and saying that she decided that for the sake of souls, she would sacrifice herself in just this way. And so therefore, the ego, the self, had to die, so that Jesus could actually live. Now, the process by where that happened was when she began to discover what she calls her own misery. Her own misery is a poverty of spirit that allows her to be able to see the hope that Jesus has for her. She becomes more and more dependent upon him. She comes up, she realizes the great things that God is asking of her, and she feels totally inadequate to the task. A little bit the way I did when I came up the stairs a few minutes ago there. and thought he was talking about somebody else. But she felt totally inadequate, as I said, to the task. But as she began to listen, she began to be reassured. And as soon as she would find the reassurance entering in, she'd also find the doubts entering in. And isn't that a common complaint? You only have to try to be still for a few minutes to see all the thoughts and everything else that rises up. And she had all of that. But Jesus would say to her, I'll speak through your confessors to reassure you. And so often not then what you would hear in conversation with him when she went to her spiritual director, when she went to a confession, she would hear back from them, and that was a confirmation for her, and that held her. And it also formed a soul of obedience. Now, one of the other things that is important about listening is the interaction that takes place. When you listen to someone, something of themselves is being imparted to you, whether it be at a very surface level or whether it be at a very depth level. And we all know that the difficulty with listening is that very often or not, it's very hard to listen at a heart level. You know, can sometimes listen at a head level, and I'm very good at that. And not always easy to listen at a heart level. But when you're listening to somebody at a depth level, they're imparting to you all the time something of themselves. And if you listen carefully, you'll be able to pick up what it is that's been imparted. Whether it's hurt, whether it's worry, whatever it is. If you listen not at all, you hear very little. Now, I'm not going to override you to death this morning with all these technical phrases, but I'm going to tell you a story that happened to myself that will indicate to you something of what happens when people listen, and perhaps it will give you some idea of the tremendous influence reading the life of Faustina can have. A few weeks ago, I was in a shop in work for St. Paul's bookshop, and this man coming off the road, and just to show you how your listening can be dulled, he seemed to be pretty down on his luck. And he came into the shop and he was shaken. And immediately what came up in my mind is, God, what's he looking for? Maybe it's a soft touch, ought to give him a few up, ought to do this, ought to do the other. And he began to tell me something of his story. And by now these preconceptions were to the forefront of my mind. So although I was hearing what he said, I was sort of saying to myself, well, when is the bite going to come? What's he looking for? When are we going to have to, right? So he began to talk about his story, and it transpired that the man had at one point had an unhappy life. He had been in religious life, he had left that, and he had married, and that hadn't turned out too well, and now he was on the streets and he was counselling youngsters. And into the bargain, someone had taken a shot at him because he was trying to counsel them away from drugs. And I knew, looking as he began to shake, that he was beginning to, body language first began to take effect. I knew there was something more in this guy. And so I listened, and still through the words that were coming to me, you had this kind of, you ever turn on the radio and you hear the static? That's what it was like. I could hear what he was saying, but just still through all of that, there was this kind of noise to what he was saying. And then, like that, he said to me, grabbed my hands up, will you say a prayer for me? And it was then that I started to listen with my heart. And I said, sure, I'll say a prayer for you. And I prayed the prayer of protection, the Blessed Michael, for him. And he said, thanks very much. And he was gone. And I thought, I stood there thinking of that for a few minutes, and I thought, God, I completely misjudged the guy. And he thought I did him a favour. So I thought that was all there was to it. And about half an hour later, who comes in the door? Only a man again. And he shoves into my hand with the Blessed Michael prayer. And he says, God bless you, God bless you. He said, you inspire people. Now, the little bit I know about listening comes from reading the diary of Sister Faustina. And there's another little book called Revelations of Mercy, they're kind of day-by-day account. And when I get time, I kind of mull over that. And I suppose the grace of God, maybe just listen a little bit on that day to what was actually being said. Now, if you notice the dynamic of what actually happened there, right? When I began to listen at a deeper level to this man's story, something happened in him. A resurrection experience occurred, only briefly, maybe only a momentary unity thing. But he became encouraged. Suddenly there was hope where previously there wasn't anything. And this was all because I heard something and I stopped and I thought, Lord, just for that moment. And I thought, I have to be honest with you, I thought, my God, I'm an awful fake. You know, the guy thought I really did something for him, and I really didn't. And when I thought about the experience afterward, I think I got more out of it than he did. He resurrected me because he made me become aware that there is something else. That you can have preconceived notions. And they're all around you all the time. Remember I said to you about Faustine and all these other voices that you heard. You're mad, you're nuts, you're a fool. Even at the end of her life, and Satan himself tempted her. Why are you doing all of this? So you'll spend all these graces with none left for yourself. Do you think God cares? When we hear those voices every day of the week, and we're called upon to listen to an authentic voice in ourselves, the voice of Jesus. And when we do, even for that momentary time, wonderful things happen. Because it had to have, for that man in his condition, to come back and make a statement like that in the first place. But I give you that story, I ask you to think about it. Because coming after me will be ones greater than I am. What I heard about, despite what he said. There'll be people coming after me who are greater than I am. And I want you to listen carefully. Because one of them is going to open you up and teach you what the poor can teach you as I've learned it. One of them is going to speak to you about the scriptures. And if you listen to the two together, combine what's here, you're going to go out of here and you're going to be better apostles of divine mercy. Sister Faustina was so immured with Jesus, in love with him, that she never lost an opportunity to immerse herself in divine mercy. And so I'm going to do the same for you this morning. I'm going to give you that opportunity to listen. I'm going to give you that opportunity not to listen with these, but to listen with this, with the ears of the soul. So what I want you to do now is just to close your eyes for a few moments. Will you do that? Put your feet on the ground and just relax in the best way that you can. Now Jesus, I'm sure, has a word for every single person in the audience here today. And he himself is going to give you that. He's going to say to you what that word is. But in order for you to hear it, you may need to steep yourself in this spirituality. So if you're ready, we begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Help me, O Lord, that my eyes might be merciful, so that I may never subject or judge from appearances, but look for what is beautiful in my neighbour's souls, and come to the rescue. Help me, that my ears may be merciful, so I may give heed to my neighbour's needs, and not be indifferent to the pains and the moanings. Help me, Lord, that my tongue may be merciful, so that I should never speak negatively of my neighbour, but have a word of comfort and forgiveness for all. Help me, Lord, that my hands might be merciful, and filled with good deeds, so that I may do only good to my neighbour, and take upon myself the more difficult and toilsome tasks. Help me, O Lord, that my heart might be merciful, so that I myself may feel all the sufferings of my neighbour. I will refuse my heart to no one. I will be sincere, even when those I know will abuse my kindness. I will lock myself up in the most merciful heart of Jesus. I will hear my own suffering in silence. May your mercy, O Lord, rest upon me. You yourself command me to exercise these degrees of mercy. The first is an act of mercy, of whatever kind. The second is a word of mercy. If I cannot carry out mercy, I will assist by my words. The third prayer, if I cannot show mercy by deeds or words, I can always do so by prayer. My prayer reaches even where I cannot go physically. I'm sure now we've prayed to Faustina to intercede with Jesus, to give us all of those graces that allow us to be steeped in the compassionate heart of Jesus and his mercy. Now, sometimes when you look at an icon like Faustina, who's about to be canonized, you think to yourself, God, I can never do that. I'd need to be living in a convent to be able to work like that. And her spirituality certainly is her own. But nevertheless, Jesus called you today. He invited you here today to be apostles of his mercy, that you might give him your heart so he can give you his, and in turn listen, and be transformed and touched in just that way. When you ask yourselves, how can I be merciful? Maybe all it takes is just a few minutes to listen. Now I have to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to finish with this, I hope I'm not finishing too early, but I am going to finish with this because there's other people, as I say, that have lots to tell you. I am not the best person in the world to be giving you this conversation or this talk on listening. I am the world's worst person in the world. And part of that does have to do with the psychological difficulties. When I was very young, my father was very authoritarian, I think, and he used to say, shut up, shut up, or he kind of tended to be slightly afraid of them in that respect. And as a consequence then, I think nervousness would make me talk. And as a worst consequence of that, I didn't tend to listen at all. Now, on those times when I find my listening ability waning, which doesn't take too long at all, I remember and I'm inspired by something that Faustina wrote in her Battle for Stillness. She used to write out, I'm sure again, many of the religious here will understand this, but I'm saying it for you people who are not religious and don't know. Back in 1925, monastic and religious life was extremely different from what it is today. There were mortifications and different things that they would do. One of those things is called the grand silence. And during that point, at certain times during the day, everyone in the order would remain silent. Now, when she's writing about her silences and her stillnesses, of course this is where Jesus is actually talking to her during these times. But initially, it's a battle for her, as it is for all of us, to remain silent. I mean, how do you remain silent in a world that's full of communication? Well, this is how she did it. She'd write down, I maintained my silence today 30 times, and I failed 40, right? And you can see from the reference that she's given in her diary the tremendous struggle that there was to be silent. And that gives me great hope that if I persevere with a few minutes silence during the day, try to take time to be out with the Lord, that one day I will achieve what she's achieved. And if I can offer it up for souls, so much the better. if one person is touched by prayer or by the word of mercy, then it's all been worthwhile, because the whole human race is touched. I've had that experience one time. I was very tired one evening, came in, and I said, Jesus, I can't, I just can't say the rosary. I said, the tongue would not, but I said, there'll be nothing coming out, you'll have to do it yourself. And I began to pray the rosary, and as I said, I began, the way, I'm sure every one of you had that experience of beginning to say the prayers. It's just like something to ramble off, right? So I had done that, but I had it was a heavy day, and I'd been into that. And suddenly, I don't know where the power came from within me, but the words took on a meaning, and they went out, and I had this mental image in mind of a prison somewhere in the world, and men who are fallen heavily were raised on wings of prayer, because as my Hail Mary went out, the Lord was able to take it and do so much more with it. So, with that, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to leave you and go back to doing what I do best, and try and look after you a bit on the floor. I'd ask you to bear with me during the day. We've talked, we've communed together, we've understood one another a little bit in terms of listening. Now we're going off the floor. I'll try to listen to all your needs. Be patient with me. I'm only learning. Thanks very, very much indeed.